For most of my life, if somebody asked me where I was from, I didn't have an easy answer. But Fort McMurray wasn't on the map. It was too far north. I mean, even those pull-down maps they had on the classroom wall when I was a kid, they used to cut off right above Edmonton, like there was nothing or nobody up there. But oil put Fort McMurray on the map. In 1967, the Great Canadian Oil Sands Company officially opened the world's first oil mine just north of town. And I was born 3 years later. And that makes me about the same age as industry. And in my lifetime, it's grown from an obscure outpost of experimental engineering into the largest and most destructive industrial project in human history. When I was 14 years old, I decided I would become a professional musician because music had nothing to do with oil. In the morning after my last day of high school, I moved to New York. And if this were a movie, this is where the story might end. But it's not. And now it's April 2015. It's nearly 30 years later, and this is my life. I live in New York. I'm a professional musician. And I'm on stage as a panelist at an Earth Day event on the arts and climate change. Now there's 4 of us sitting in this low, elegant chairs in this sleek, blonde wood LEED certified auditorium in New York City. And there's a massive projection screen behind us. And my fellow panelists, I mean, everyone there was impeccable. Their projects, their haircuts, their sneakers. There's a designer who's making gaming apps for refugees and a DJ/philosopher who's sonifying data on climate change in Antarctica. And somebody starts talking about the Keystone XL pipeline. It was all over the news then, right? That pipeline protest movement was really gaining momentum, right? And someone says tar sands. Someone says dirty oil. And I can tell it. They've seen the pictures, right? The oil-soaked ducks, the toxic tailings ponds, the earth skinned alive. And they don't know it, but they're talking about my life. They're talking about Fort McMurray, a place where I was born. And I'm pinned to this stage in New York City, and something starts to shatter inside me. Now on the outside, I'm holding it together. I'm nodding my head. I'm making these thoughtful remarks, but inside, I'm realizing that I've spent 30 years trying to keep these 2 places, these 2 parts of my life separate. Oil and music, Alberta and New York. And now it's like they're colliding inside of me on stage, on live stream. And I can't just sit there, right? While people talk about the end of the world as it's playing out in the place where I was born. And that's when I hear myself say it. And I was born in Fort McMurray. I became a musician because it had nothing to do with oil. And I could feel it. You know, the room woke up. There was this energy. I had authority. And just as quickly, I felt ashamed for reducing this complicated place, my family, this wound, into a perfect soundbite. Fort McMurray is where I was born. It's where my dad's Esso station was. My stepfather was an engineer for Suncor. It's where my stepbrother, Philip, died. And it's where my mother heard a symphony orchestra for the first time. It's not like the world really needs another panel discussion, right? I needed to go home. So, 1967. My brother Peter is 5 months old when my mom and dad leave one northern Canadian mining town for another. My mother says,
well, we were really looking forward to this move to Fort McMurray from Thompson, Manitoba. It seems to me that we were looking at a fresh start, and the company, Great Canadian Oil Sands, was making some pretty good offers to young people. In fact, I think that we had an interest-free mortgage.
Now, my dad was usually out. Hold on one second. I don't know what happened there. Excuse me, we're going to have to rejigger the tech here for a second. I'm going to throw myself into speaker mode, and we are going to be here. I want you to imagine that we are sitting in a room together. My friend that I teach with sometimes says that Zoom is not a room, that there is something called Zoom Mansion. And I love how he creates this expansive sense of space in it, and that there's like breakout rooms and like all these spaces you can go. So if you can, settle yourself in and imagine that we're in just a beautiful, spacious room together with, I don't know, a nice fireplace. And we're going to go on. All right. So my dad was usually out. He was out on site or up at the Oil Can Tavern. It's not exactly what my mother expected. As one of her old friends told me when I went to Fort McMurray for the first time, she said, well, your parents, they weren't really a good match. I mean, maybe it's different in this day and age, but back then, women couldn't be smarter than men. 1970, I'm born. My dad shows up this time. Now, Dad didn't like working at the plant. He wanted to be an entrepreneur. So he quit GCOS and he bought an Esso station. And we left the company house with the interest-free mortgage, and we moved to this little house behind the service station on Franklin and Main. In Fort McMurray, it was like any small town. I mean, people really relied on each other, right? And Ernest was up there. He was over a lot. My mom knew him from Thompson. He was a bigwig at the plant. She said he was an engineer. 1973. My dad is done with Fort McMurray. We moved to Edmonton, the big city. My dad opens another Esso station. We live in a neighborhood called Petrolia. We root for the Edmonton Oilers. The McDonald's had a pump jack in the playground. And on the southern edge of the city, the Leduc No. 1 oil derrick stands on guard. As a child, I used to think this was my Eiffel Tower. 1977. My mom and dad get divorced. Now, Ernest gets divorced, and GCOS becomes Suncor, and Suncor transfers Ernest to Edmonton, and we visit his bachelor apartment with its Danish swivel chairs and its low teak tables. My mom is a single mother of two. She's back in university. Ernest courts her. He grooms her. He marries her, and they hold their reception at the Petroleum Club. 1981. Suncor transfers Ernest to Calgary, and we move to a house in a new development called Ranchlands. Now, Ernest sits in the front room with his Danish swivel chairs, and he's smoking his pipes and listening to his classical music LPs, and he puts framed color photographs on the wall, upgraders and compressors, their curved pipes gleaming at sunset, the gas flares and smokestacks like beacons. And on the stereo console, there's this executive set of 6 glass jars containing oil sand, bitumen, tailing sand, petcoke, sulfur, and crude. We don't talk about oil because it's normal. So now it's July 2016. It's a year after that panel discussion, and I did what an academic does. I got a grant to go home. And I'm driving into Fort McMurray. I'm going north on Highway 63. It's pouring rain, and I'm with my new friend, Sheldon. He's taking me up to see the mining sites, but he says, first, we got to make a pit stop. If we're going out to the sites, we've got to get Tim Hortons and a pack of smokes. You're going to need a donut and a coffee and a smoke if you're going to see that shit. It's go time, bro. Fort Mac. So we hit the Tim's drive-thru and we stop at the 7-Eleven for a pack of smokes. Then we're crossing the Athabasca River, sipping double doubles and eating honey crullers and blowing smoke out of the windows of the rental car. And here's what I see out the window. Coming out of town, there's these low office buildings for industry service companies. There's heavy equipment yards. And then they start to leave these little strips of trees on either side of the road so you can't see what's going on. There's a logging yard. There's tree trunks stacked like corpses. Constant traffic. There's white pickup trucks with buggy whips, gravel trucks, tankers, shift buses carrying workers in and out of the sites. And you climb this big hill, and on the far bank of the Athabasca, in a gap in the trees, you see one of the mining sites, like a distant city. And we see the entrance to the Suncor base site, the Atco trailers. And we get a little whiff of the sulfur smell. Then we round the curve, and the trees on Gateway Hill give way to the East Mine. Everybody says there's no words for it, but I told Sheldon it looked like a desert of tailing sand with this heroic billboard, reclamation in progress. And out in the distance, the Syncrude upgrader plant. And on the right, there's a tailings pond. And it's not a pond, it's a lake. It's like a vast, flat, sad-looking lake if a lake had a barbed wire fence. And if I could play it for you right now, you'd hear this sound, little distant popping noises going off from all different directions. They've got these propane cannons all the way around the surface. They've got these dummies out on platforms on the surface of the water, dressed in coveralls and hard hats. They're like scarecrows. Sheldon calls them scare ducks. And you can kind of hear it floating in, this eerie sort of shrieking sound. It took me a while to figure out that it's a bird's distress call recorded on a loop. Now the cannons and the shrieks and the dummies, they're all part of this elaborate system to keep birds from landing on the water, because if the birds land there, they die. You know, this is where my stepfather went every day all those years. I never saw this. I saw the signs of it. I saw the logos on his pens. I saw the safety vest and the hard hat in his closet. But he never said a word about this. Now, Sheldon and I are driving past Syncrude's Giants of Mining exhibit. It's where they put this decommissioned bucket wheel and drag line in a park, picnic tables. And it's right across the highway from the Mildred Lake upgrader facility. And Sheldon's driving, I'm driving. Sheldon's next to me talking a mile a minute, and he says, "Look at that huge house of a shovel, right? That's an old wheel. I think those are the old dinosaurs they don't use anymore. But you see, as a man or as a woman, when you come to work and you walk up to a structure like that, you are absolutely like, are you kidding me? You want me to drive that thing?" And I'm like totally buying in, like I'm injecting it, like, it's the coolest. And he goes, "Yeah, it's the absolute coolest. And that's the thing." I said, "It's the ultimate Tonka truck." He says, "You know what? That's exactly what my first foreman said on my first shift on the first day of the job." He said, "We are so blessed. We get the biggest Tonka trucks in the biggest sandbox in the world." A year later, we were still talking about it. We were sitting on the north bank of the Athabasca in Edmonton. He says, "It's, I don't know. It's scary. It's like, you know, for myself, I got to say that there's an element of shock and awe that comes with it, you know? Like, it's almost like you can't believe that it's real. And then they hand you a shovel, you know, and they say, go do this. They hand you the keys to a truck and they say, go haul this. And then you're part of the machinery, right? So what they're mining up there is bitumen. You can imagine a mixture of quartz sand, clay, and oil. I have some here in my hand. I don't know if I can, it's kind of dried out right now. I don't know if you can see it there. There's like little crumbles. And you can see it everywhere up there if you know how to look for it. It's on the riverbanks in the summer, gleaming, oozing out of the sun, out of the earth where the sun hits it. And about 80% of the extraction these days is SAGD, or steam-assisted gravity drainage. That's where they pump steam under the surface of the water, kind of loosen the bitumen and make it easier to extract the oil. But the other 20% is surface mining, open pit mining. And that's what you see in the pictures. You know, like the ones about the earth ripped apart. And here's how they get the oil out of the oil sands. You know, first they scrape up the vegetation and the soil. They call that the overburden in mining. And then they use power shovels to scoop the oil sands out and load them into these giant trucks. Those are trucks that are the biggest trucks in the world, right? And the trucks dump the oil sands into crushers to break it up. Then they mix that with hot water and they draw that from the river. And they pipe the slurry over to the extraction plant. And there's a museum in Fort McMurray called the Oil Sands Discovery Center. And they do this demonstration of the separation process. And they use like ordinary kitchen tools on a cart. And they take this 1 liter Erlenmeyer flask, which is really looks like a Pyrex beaker from a French press. And they call it a primary conditioning vessel in the demo. And they pour in boiling water from an electric kettle. And they stir the water with a spoon to condition the slurry. And they hold the spoon up to show you how the quartz wears away at the steel. They skim off the froth, and you see these 3 layers. There's bitumen at the top, and the middlings with the leftover process water, and the tailings, the coffee grounds, like if you can imagine in a French press. Well, they can't dump that back into the river, so they make these reinforced ponds to hold the waste. And inside that, you've got things like naphthenic acids and cyanide and phenols and arsenic and cadmium and chromium and copper and lead and zinc. And that's what's in the tailings ponds. So when I graduated from Juilliard in 1992, I really thought I had arrived. I got 2 pieces of professional advice. The first was, take care of the music, and the music will take care of you. And the second was, if you can see yourself doing anything else for a living, do it. Now, I dismissed that second piece of advice as irrelevant because I'd never imagined myself doing anything but music. But I took that first piece of advice as sacrosanct. It was a noble contract. Music couldn't fail me. Only I could fail music. And when I arrived at Juilliard, I thought I had arrived. I mean, one of my classmates came to school in his father's Learjet. Other kids would come to class with shopping bags from Chanel. And some kids lived in these gleaming high-rises that were sprouting up around Lincoln Center. And I lived in this decrepit room in the 63rd Street Y. But I thought I'd arrived, you know? I'd passed the gatekeepers. My talent was vetted by jury. I could not fail. And then 6 months after graduation, I quit. I went back to Alberta, moved back in with my mom and my stepfather, and they figured it was time for another plan, you know, something more sensible. So I went back to school for psychology and then history, and then I went to the U of A for my PhD. Anyway, the point is I was there in Alberta, right, in the 90s. That unbridled development was happening all around me. But I still didn't see it. And we never spoke about it. So let's go back to Fort McMurray. Fort McMoney, or as the billboard says when you enter town, a vibrant, sustainable region that we are proud to call home. Fort McMurray is a classic boomtown. Its fate rises and falls with the price of oil. And when I was born, the population was about 6,000 people, and oil was $21.32 a barrel. In June 2008, when crude oil peaked at $160 a barrel, the population was about 88,000 and maybe another 30,000 fly-in, fly-out workers. And the price of oil today, by the way, is $42 a barrel, which is better than it was in April when it plunged 321% in one day to minus $37 per barrel. But anyway, the point is it's changed a lot. My dad's Esso station is now the 7-Eleven. My old house is an empty lot. There's trucks parked in the dirt where I used to play. But when I stand there, I can still see it, my childhood home. The upright piano comes shimmering into my eye, pressed up against the wood-paneled wall. There's my brother and me on either side of the couch, on either side of my mother, with our arms filled with black kittens. I can see my mom pacing the floor at night, my dad out at the oil can again. The thing is, if you look at the town one way, you see a mid-sized city, like anywhere else in North America. There's chain restaurants and superstores, strip malls with yoga studios, nail salons, and sushi restaurants. There's Canadian Tire. You look at it the other way, you might see the Boomtown Casino, the head shop, the Money Mart, the liquor stores, the signs for criminal defense attorneys, the Fort Mac douchebags and jacked up trucks idling in the long line at the Tim Hortons drive-thru, little knots of Somali cab drivers smoking in the parking lot, the Confederate flag nestled amongst the wolf blankets for sale out of the back of a white van. But if you care about global warming, Fort McMurray is ground zero for climate change. If you care about conservative politics, it's a secure source of ethical oil. If you're an engineer, it's the Silicon Valley of the North. If you're the mayor, it's a community where people from all over the world come in search of unparalleled economic opportunities. And if you're a celebrity flying in to make a statement like Leo DiCaprio, it's Mordor. Look, there's a contest over who gets to define the place. The stakes are really high because people have been promised a lot. Now, just before I went back to Fort McMurray for the first time, the Edmonton Journal did a story about me and my research, and the article got some comments. The name of the book suggests she's planning to take a dump on her hometown. Oh no. When I read the lead for this article, I thought, not another misinformed Neil Young environmental artist wannabe hit on the oil sands. Climate change is a hoax which serves no purpose except to consolidate power in the hands of the government and fleece the public out of their hard-earned money. You lost me when you called it tar sands. Where the hell does she live? There's no such thing as tar sands on this planet. Tar sands? Anybody using that term is a fool. But they always called it tar sands when I was a kid. It was affectionate. I remember it being like a nickname. It wasn't until the 90s that industry and government got together to rebrand the tar sands as the oil sands. I get it. Oil. It's useful, neutral, natural, scientific. Tar, sticky, nasty, gross. It took a corporate social responsibility consultant to turn the term tar sands into an insult, but that's another story. And I didn't know any of that when I started this project. But I'm keeping the name. It's time for a song. Four strong winds that blow lonely, seven seas that run high, all those things that don't change, come what may. But our good times are all gone, and I'm bound for moving on. I'll look for you if I'm ever back this way. Think I'll go out to Alberta, weather's good there in the fall. Got some friends that I could go to working for. Still, I wish you'd change your mind if I asked you one more time. But we've been through this 100 times or more. I want you to meet some of the people that I met when I went back. Like Alice. Alice lives in Fort Chipewyan. It's It's a small community downstream from the mining operations. And I might not need to tell you this, but in the States, I often have to clarify to people that downstream in this case is north because the rivers run in all directions. But a lot of people here just kind of assume that like it flows down here. So anyway, to get to Alice's house, you can take a short flight north in a small plane. You fly over the mines and you watch them give way to muskeg and wetlands and sand dunes and ribbons of rivers. You walk east along the shore of Lake Athabasca and you find the driveway opposite the stone monument. You walk up past her garden and you find her sitting on the front porch in the warm afternoon sun with her dog Toby at her feet. She says, "Well, I'm 65 years old, and industry is not 65 years old. So I saw the changes from the start. When I think back, I never thought there would be such a drastic change. They say a delta is always changing, but not to the extent that we have now. I was 13 years old when I went to Fort McMurray by boat, and we stopped at Suncor, which was called GCOS then, and they were just starting to clear the land. I remember them taking down these big, beautiful white spruce, just towers of it. Did I ever think it would be like this? And then everything just sort of went down, and it's been going down ever since. We don't go out to Jackfish Lake anymore. Jackfish had everything that we needed. Sometimes when the white fish was really good, we would move to the lake and stay in a tent and just make dry fish. And evenings, my dad would go hunting for a moose or a bear. It was a good life, you know. It was the best. An industry will come to Chip, you know, we tell them all our problems, and I'm sure they've heard it over and over again from every angle, from every young voice to the oldest voice. And we keep saying, come with us. We'll show you. They never come out with us. I want to show them Jackfish Lake. We have a cemetery there. That's where I'm going to bury my husband and my son next month, on that hill where a lot of my ancestors are buried. The industry has its own relationship to the land. It's like Rick George, the former CEO of Suncor, wrote in his memoir, "The most appealing feature of the oil sands is that they were there to be taken." And Sheldon says, you look around right now, and what you see, this flat muskeg peppered with tamarack and pine, it's what's under there. It's all that energy. This land was an organic paradise, you know, lush. And I'm no geologist, you know, but what you see is that flat, black, loamy muskeg that goes on for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. Underneath it is all the energy of the sun that was absorbed by living things. And in their death converted, that energy remains, right? You see, when I look at this terrain, I see muskeg tea. I see blueberries. I see all the medicines that we use, the rat root. I see our sustenance. I see our ability as Indigenous people to be able to survive for thousands of years. You know, this landscape contains our connection to the earth, you know, but you look at it as a developer and you say, I can't build on this shit. You look at it as a pulp and paper guy, you say there's no marketable resource here. There's nothing of any value except the death, that oil that lies beneath. Now, Sheldon. I met Sheldon at the healing gathering for the land and the water. It was my first stop on my first trip back. It's a 3-day event held on Fort McMurray First Nations territory, and I found it on Facebook. And I called the number on the event, and I ended up in this long conversation with Cleo Reese, the organizer. And Cleo made me feel so welcome. She made me feel like I needed no greater reason to come back than for the fact that I'd been born. And Sheldon was up there. I saw him. He was setting up camp like he was trying to win a contest, right? He's got the tarps. He's like whittling poles and he's fishing. And at night, he was the guy with the guitar holding court in the big white tent. And I heard the music. So I went up to him and I said, hey, it sounds like you could use a fiddle. And he says, yeah, right. And I had this flash of shame and anger, like I'm 21 years old again, and another guy in a plaid shirt is trying to tell me I'm not, up to his level. And I said to myself, no, look, you're 46 years old. You're a professional musician. You live in New York City. Just go get the goddamn fiddle. So I go back to my tent and I grab the case and I walk back and I start playing along. And like, I know what I'm doing, right? Because I've been doing this for 30 years. Like, I know what the chords are. I know what to play. I know when to give him a little nudge to let his voice soar. I know when to, play the notes between the phrases that tell everything that the lyrics couldn't say. I just know how to do this. And I finished the song, and Sheldon looks at me, and he's got tears running down his face. He looks at me and he says, "Where'd you come from?" So, when my mother married my stepfather, Ernest, I thought we had arrived. My Uncle Ernest was a man of the world. He taught me about food. He taught me about olives and cheese, and he took me on his Saturday morning rounds in Edmonton. At the Italian Center, the man behind the deli counter handed me a slice of mortadella. The white pearls of fat were glistening in the pink flesh. At the Lebanese bakery, the man handed me a loaf of pita bread straight from the conveyor belt, puffed up like an animal still alive, releasing its steam. When I got new brothers, the youngest of them was Philip. He was 12 years older than me. He came from England to live with us and go to school, and he took me seriously. And I spent my summers with my granny in Gilbert Plains, Manitoba, and Granny taught me how to pluck a chicken after I watched her cut its head off with an axe. She taught me how to make pickles and cabbage rolls and pierogies, and we'd lay those pierogies out on floured cookie sheets and cover them with white tea towels. And at the end of the day, the men would come in and devour hours worth of our work in minutes. I learned that this is the way it goes. And all of this was my childhood, right? But as I got older, it was clear that there was one direction in particular in which we were headed. It was forward and up. And up meant upward in social class. And my mother didn't really put me in violin lessons because she wanted me to become a musician. She put me in violin lessons because she wanted me to be educated. And when people say music, they mean a lot of different things. So 1977, I'm 7 years old. I've been in violin lessons for 4 years, and I'm in Gilbert Plains, Manitoba, because my cousin Laureen is getting married, and I am a flower girl. I'm wearing a yellow and white gingham dress that Uncle Ernest bought just for me. And the men in the community hall at the reception, they smoke and they tell their stories and they pour Ryan Cokes and they tap long bands of ash into round tin ashtrays. And the women stand by the tables of pierogies and pickles and cabbage rolls. And there's a band and there's a fiddler. And someone says to me, "Hey, go on, why don't you play the Red River Jig?" But I don't know their tunes and they don't know mine. 1982, I'm 12 years old. We're living in Calgary and I join a group called the Calgary Fiddlers. We play in unison on the float for the Calgary Stampede Parade. We play on CBC television. We play in white Stetsons and black Chinese slippers and red and white gingham shirts. We play the Irish washerwoman with our violins behind our backs and between our knees. And we play a show, and my mom and my Uncle Ernest were there, and my granny was in town, and she came too. And my mom tells me that Granny was in her glory because she could relate to this music, right? But Ernest leans over to my mom and says, "Is there some reason why Tanya's doing this?" So I always say, if you want to know what the difference is between a fiddle and a violin, it's not the instrument, it's something else. Here's the thing, it's actually not that hard to play the violin. All you have to do is find a decent teacher and do what they tell you to do, right? You go home after school, you go to your room, you open up the case, you take the fiddle out, and you do exactly what they tell you to do. You go from Suzuki Book 1 to Book 2, 3, and 4. You go from the teacher near your house to the teacher you take 2 buses to get to. You go from local to provincial to national competitions, from national to international festivals. I went from group lessons at age 3 to Carnegie Hall at age 16 to Juilliard at 17. In arts and education world, they call that a pipeline. And people assume that if you went to Juilliard, you can play anything, but it's not true. Because fiddling, I mean, in Calgary, a fiddler's an entertainer, but up north, a fiddler's a specialist. Before YouTube or TV or radio, if a fiddler was around, people would come from all over. And that first trip back, when people found out I had a violin with me, it was only a matter of time before someone would ask me, "So, could you play the Red River Jig?" I called my mom and told her about it when I came back to Fort McMurray, and she said, "Well, what do you expect, Jen? Of course, you need to know the Red River Jig." And I'm like, wow. So now it's New Year's Eve in Brooklyn, 2017, and I'm literally sitting exactly where I am right now, and I'm trying to learn the Red River Jig. I download these MP3s from iTunes. Long dead fiddlers from Manitoba, Métis fiddlers, Hap Boyer, Andy Desjardins. Fiddlers my uncles loved. And I post something about it on Facebook, and my cousins Shirley and Mona comment, "We can't wait to hear this." It's like they all knew something that I didn't. They knew this tune was an essential text. I bought a video lesson from Calvin Volrath in Edmonton, and that's where I learned that you have to take the G string and you have to tune it up a whole step. Like this. Every time I do the show, I say I'm going to get fine tuners, and I don't. Anyway, Calvin said that the violin is a voice, and the bow is like the tongue. The thing is, you can't get Métis culture out of a YouTube video. The Red River Jig is not some fiddle style, it's the sound of self-determination. I want you to imagine a fiddle in a canoe, like a tool of cultural survival. I watched this 1975 documentary from the National Film Board of Canada. In it, there's a trapper, Frank Ladisser, talking about the Red River Jig traveling up the fur trade route. Up from the Red River Valley, Minnesota, North Dakota, Manitoba, and north through Saskatchewan and farther north, all the way up to Fort Chipewyan, where Frank's father is playing the fiddle in a cabin set into the snow and the night like a jewel. And everyone dances. Now, economists have names for things, and the indirect effects of industrial activity, whether they're positive or negative, are called externalities. So when they talk about externalities in oil production, they talk about things like increased employment or production on one hand, or environmental damage or health risks on the other. So whether you're getting a new job or you're getting chemotherapy, it's the same word, right? In the 1940s, Buckminster Fuller coined a term, energy slave. It's a way of understanding the energy we use in terms of units of human labor. And it turns out that the energy needs of the typical North American lifestyle today would require something like 500 human slaves. But industry and government have tied oil tightly to our personal sense of power. And we buy it, right? Like the idea that if we don't have oil, we'll be failures. Back in the Stone Age, living in mud huts or something. So they keep us wanting more, afraid of losing our power. And we don't notice it. Like we only notice oil when something goes wrong, like when there's a pipeline spill, or in that brief moment or two where we can really bring ourselves to think about climate change. The rest of the time, oil flows out of the ground and invisibly into every aspect of our lives. You might think of this as a kind of invisible spill everywhere. Oil rippling through our bodies, racing through our blood and our dreams and our desires. Now it's my second trip to Fort McMurray in 2017. And I pulled over by the east side of Highway 63 by the Syncrude tailings pond. And I hear this high-pitched whine in my headphones. And I look up and I see 3 security trucks and 3 young women in uniforms and work boots. And they stop me and they ask me what I'm taking pictures of and why. And they want me to tell them my name and where I'm from and who I'm working for. And I tell them I'm doing research. They tell me it's private property. I say I think it's a provincial highway and I'm allowed to stand on the berm. They keep asking for my name until I said, look, am I in trouble? Because if not, I'd rather just pack up and go. They said it wasn't safe for me to be there. Now, it really bothers me when they use safety as a rhetorical strategy for social control. So I talked to 3 guys named Dave who work for industry, because I wanted to connect safety to a sense of what's really at risk. So Dave, number 1, is an engineer for big oil. He thinks risk is knowable. Well, I have to believe that every problem has a set of solutions. Now, you think about risk as an unknown quantity, so it scares you, but we think risk is measurable and manageable. We can eliminate it, or we can move it to an acceptable level. Now, there's something called the risk matrix. You can Google it. I mean, basically, it's a grid with severity on one axis and probability on the other. And basically, our job is just to move things from the red zone into the orange and the green zone. Dave, too, works on oil plant sites doing environmental testing. He thinks that risk is concealed. Well, before anybody gets in, the job site is notified. We make like a tourist place for high-placed employees. We go build a site and we make it so that they can't get into the bad places, It's like a big stage out there. It's like a movie set. And for the regulators, we just do the same thing. None of those guys want to get into chest waders and go out in the middle of that shit. And it's just, I don't know. It's everything out there. It's just made up. Now, Dave 3 thinks I should question what my other 2 Daves have to say. He says, now, one thing I always tell people is that if you speak to anyone up here and they tell you something, even if it's me, I want you to treat me the same way. Ask yourself, why is this person telling me this? What does this person want me to believe? Now, I hope I tell the truth, and I strive really hard to tell nothing but the truth, but I mean, it's just sometimes the truth. It's just told in different ways. Now, I had read about the rare cancers in Fort Chipewyan, but when I got there, I saw how the damage isn't all on the surface. And not everybody wants to talk about it. And not everyone agreed about what was going on. Alice said, days when we used to just scoop our cup from the river. But other people would say, well, you're going to hear a lot of I used to be able to take my cup and dip it in the water. Well, you know what? You never should have been drinking that water anyway. You should boil it, because think about it. Where does the fish poop? Where does the duck poop? Where does the beaver poop? Alice says, when the ducks died, those thousands of ducks, we had Suncor up here and they could not even finish their presentation. They were just bombarded with questions about the water. That set off a panic where some mothers were using bottled water to wash their babies. Now, they closed the fishery in 2014, and some people would tell me it was because of development, but other people would say it was because of over-harvesting. But Alice said, that's bullshit. It's because no one's going to buy deformed fish that are toxic. And some people would say that oil's been leaking into that river for millions and millions and millions of years before this. That's why the oil-eating bacteria developed. But then the director of water and strategic closure from Suncor, he comes up to Fort Chip and he walks into the front of the room and he writes on a whiteboard 2 things. Number 1, the Athabasca River is not polluted. Number 2, the low water levels are due to the Bennett Dam. So I start asking people, like, how can you prove how much of this oil is naturally occurring and how much was emitted by which project at which time? And my friend Jewel tells me that each oil company has their own process and they're all copyrighted. She said they did test the river and it's easy to tell where the contamination is coming from. They said those hydrocarbon molecules in the river might as well have logos on them. You can tell which tailings pond they come from. It's just denial, 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 denial all around. Meanwhile, I noticed that the province of Alberta released an app called Should I Eat This Fish? So I wanted to answer this simple question. Is toxic processed water leaking from the tailings ponds or not? And I looked at a report from the Pembina Research Institute. It said, the accumulation of more than 1 trillion liters of fluid oil sands tailings in northern Alberta is the result of 5 decades of negligence and engineering failures. Estimates for the cost of cleanup range from $24 to $44 to $100 billion. And look, I couldn't wrap my head around these numbers, right? Because what is this? Billions, trillions? So I learned a couple of strategies to relate to big numbers, and now I'm going to share them with you. So one is you take a big number and you pin it to a concept that you use in everyday life, like time. 1 second is 1 second. 1,000,000 seconds is 12 days. 1,000,000,000 seconds is 31 years. And 1,000,000,000,000 seconds, 31,688 years. So 31 years or 31,688 years is this unfathomable gap between a billion and a trillion, right? Here's another strategy. You can take big numbers and shrink them down to the level of your own life. So back when Rex Tillerson was still CEO of ExxonMobil before Donald Trump briefly made him Secretary of State in the US, I mean, where is he now? His salary was $100,000 a day, which is $36.5 million a year US. I hesitate. I hasten to add. So let's say you make $50,000 a year and Rex makes 730 times more than you. So your $15 bottle of wine costs him 2 cents. And your $1,500 a month rent costs him $2. Let's get back to Alice. She's telling me about a spill that happened in the late 70s. She says when Suncor had that spill under the ice, and my brother Archie and I went out to jackfish by snowmobile, and we set a net under the ice. And my son was there, my son Keith, the one we just lost. My brothers and my dad taught him how to live off the land, so he was a real expert bushman. And we had a good catch. And to us, to catch a big whitefish, well, whitefish is one of our favorites. So he cleaned it up and he made a fire outside and he put 2 to roast over the fire. And the grease dripping from the fish was black from the oil spill. So we had a taste and it just tasted like oil. Fishing was shut down for 2 years. And Suncor got, I think, a $20,000 fine. And the fishermen never got compensated. Just a slap on the wrist for Suncor. Really showed you who the government prefers, right? I also met Big Ray Lattiser. He was a trapper and a commercial fisherman, at least until they closed the fishery down. Big Ray welcomed me into his kitchen. We sat at a table covered in that familiar double layer of fabric and clear plastic. He told me that his father was a fiddler too. He said, I fished all my life commercially, ever since I was a young boy. And it's sad. You got pickerel with pushed in faces, crooked tails, humpbacks, bulged out eyes, Same with whitefish. they're starting to get deformed. Northern pike, they're deformed. And now more trouts in Lake Athabasca that are coming in over here. They're sick. They got big heads on them, skinny little bodies, you know. This was a healthy lake at one time. We're losing lots, you know. We're losing bugs in the water. We're losing the minnows. We're losing seagulls. There used to be seagulls, thousands and thousands of them. Some of them just totally disappeared. They don't even come here now. Just those black-headed gulls that they call Franklin gulls. We still got those, but not many. But the other type of seagulls, those little black-gray gulls, there used to be millions of them here. They're gone now, totally gone. And mud hens, they call them, they're gone. And ducks, hardly any ducks around in our area. Son of a gun. Alice says, around 2000, when industry was just really rolling, you know, at the community hall here, they had displays of Syncrude and Suncor, and oh boy, just the whole. I went up to Syncrude and they had a banner that said 1 billion barrels of oil. And I said to the guy, 1 billion barrels of oil. How much water did it take to make that much oil? And he said, none. And I said, you know what? Your nose is growing. And he just turned red and I just walked away from him, because that's the attitude, that we are dumb, that we'll just roll over and let it happen. If any of those big ponds goes and destroys everything, what are we going to do? Are we going to become refugees in our own land? Now, there's a lot of things that my family never really talks about. I'd never asked my mother about my stepbrother's death. She said, it was 1981. Philip wanted to get a summer job in Fort McMurray because that's where you could make good money. And as an engineering student, it was a place to be. Ernest did find him a job with Vince Clark's company, and Vince Clark's company was contracted by GCOS, and what happened was they were flushing out a line and it exploded. In other words, it just came apart. And Philip yelled out at Matt Mullen to duck, and Matt ducked, and it hit Philip. That was the night that Prince Charles and Princess Diana were married. My mother says, the day we heard about it, I'd been up all night watching the royal wedding, and that afternoon, the CEO of the plant called and asked to speak to Ernest and told him that Philip had died. And Ernest was, I'll never forget how it was sadness for all of us. There was an investigation. It was done by the company, and of course it was the particular pipe. It was a plastic pipe, I think, and an industrial strength, but there was a fault in it, I guess. And that's what happened. I asked her if she ever saw a report. She said, there might have been a report, but I didn't see one. I mean, Ernest might have seen it, but Ernest, he would have wanted to put it behind him, because Ernest, the emotional angst would have stayed with him forever. I mean, maybe he was offered the report and didn't read it, for all I know. I was 11 years old. I remember the phone ringing. I remember Ernest coming into the hall. He cried, "Philip is dead." And that's when his silence began. So 7 weeks before I went back to Fort McMurray for the first time, a wildfire consumed the region. It was the most costly and severe natural disaster in the history of Alberta, and a hint of what would follow. I learned about the fire the same night I learned that my stepfather died. I watched both events unfold from a distance on a laptop screen in a Boston hotel room. It was May 3rd, 2016. The footage of the fire was all over the news. They evacuated the whole city. There's really only one road in or out of town, and I watched on CNN as bumper-to-bumper traffic moved slowly south on Highway 63. There were people driving through columns of flames, embers bouncing off the hood of the cars. Their voices were hushed, and nobody got hurt. The people in Fort McMurray have done their safety training. And I'm in the same fancy hotel where I've stayed every Tuesday night for 10 years, where I teach. City view, high floor. I look down and out to Huntington Avenue and the Prudential Tower, and I imagine an evacuation happening there. The news of my stepbrother's death was simple. My stepbrother Michael sent us an email with the subject line, "Father is dead." When I got back to New York, I didn't know what to do. I took one day off work. I listened to the entire opera Eugene Onegin, and I cleaned every window in my apartment. So when I was growing up, I used to think that nature could kill you, but cities were safe, right? But now it's October 29th, 2012, and Hurricane Sandy turns my Brooklyn neighborhood into a disaster zone overnight. There's National Guard trucks rumbling down Van Brunt Street. The IKEA becomes the FEMA response center. And the contents of people's lives are turned out in these heaps on the sidewalk, just soaked with sewage and seawater. And what do we do after a disaster? I mean, we're hurt and we want to know why. And we want to point the finger, but there's no clear place to point the finger because the finger goes everywhere. So you say you're a survivor, you claim your victimhood, and a victim is blameless. So you can go on with the work of surviving, and let's face it, that is hard enough. But for a moment, we wake up to the fact that we are nature, and nature is us. Lord, have mercy on your children. Lord, have mercy on your children. Lord, have mercy on your children. Lord, have mercy on us all. Christ, have mercy on your children. Christ, have mercy on your children. Christ, have mercy on your children. Christ, have mercy on us all. Lord, have mercy on your children. Lord, have mercy on your children. Lord, have mercy on your children. Lord, have mercy on us all. I think it's time for a sip of this little tumbler of whiskey that I've been holding aside. So, what do you think they're going to do with the 1.561 trillion liters of tailings? It was 1.18 when I started the project in 2016. I mean, they can say they're going to put things back together, but nature doesn't work out that way. Air pollution travels downwind, toxic waste seeps into the groundwater, and wetlands, they take tens of thousands of years to develop. And the land that they're mining is called Crown land. It's public land owned by the government and registered in the name of Her Majesty the Queen, but the Queen took it from the traditional territories of Cree, Dene, and Métis people. And when the oil companies leased the land from the Crown, they signed an agreement that says they're going to return the land as they found it in pre-disturbance condition. And they have these industry videos where nice men say things like, well, we absolutely, certainly believe that we'll be able to restore the land back to the original users so that they can continue to use this and enjoy this for the future and all future generations. Anybody from a messed up family knows that everything's fine is a lie. Industry says we're dealing with the toughest environmental standards in the world, and they are. Now, Alberta oil, they say, is the most responsibly produced energy anywhere on the planet. There's an argument for that. But here are some other facts. The province of Alberta had no regulations at all on tailings management until 2009. So industry was left to regulate itself. It's called regulatory capture. You can think of it as a form of government failure. It's another fact. Over the last 50-some years, industry has disturbed almost 1,000 square kilometers of land, and out of that, only 1 square kilometer has been reclaimed and certified and returned to the province. And I was in Fort Chip last February, the night that Teck withdrew its application for the Frontier mine. It's a project that would have turned the Peace Athabasca Delta into a $21 billion, 250,000 barrel per day open pit mine. And my hosts in Fort Chip were rejoicing. They had all lost friends and relatives to cholangiocarcinoma. But that's not what stopped Teck. What stopped Teck was the realization that there could be, quote, no constructive path forward. That it was no longer a foregone conclusion that they could make a profit. And 2 days before that, I was at the Oil Sands Discovery Center in Fort McMurray. The museum was empty. The exhibits were silent. The woman behind the counter said she was waiting for the next boom. She said she was sure it was going to come. And Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, is pretty sure it's going to come. Back in May, the Alberta Energy Regulator suspended its environmental monitoring regulations for oil and gas because I guess if you don't monitor anything, there's nothing bad to report, right? So this way they can keep saying, like, we've got the most environmentally responsible technologies and we've got the best people in the world working on it. That's what they've been saying since I was a kid. The best people. People like my stepfather, and people like the men whose homes we went to for dinner parties when I was a kid. You know, last year, my mom told me that Uncle Ernest was one of the first people to work on the tailings ponds, to design them. She was in the other room in this apartment and she just called it out to me. And she said, well, he told me it was his idea. They were just going to dump the toxic water back into the river. He told her he thought he was doing something good. So in 2016, on that first trip, one morning I got up really early and I tried to drive as far north of the mines as I could. I tried to drive as far as I could on the winter road to Fort Chip. And somewhere around 8:15 in the morning, I'm up there and I get out of the car and I record this audio diary. So normally you'd hear the recording, but I'm just going to recite for you what I said. So it's about 8:15 in the morning on Tuesday, July 11th. And I'm on a gravel road. I think it might be the winter road to Fort Chip. There's no signs anywhere. There's no one around. Anyway, I'd stopped by the side of the road to record some sounds, and I heard that bird that I love. It's going dee dee bitty 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 dee dee bitty 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 bitty. So I get out my shotgun mic and I'm standing by the side of the road and I've got my hand up high in the air and I'm listening and I'm homing in on the sound. And as I listen, it just seems to blossom. And more birds come in. And at one point, it was just this symphony. And I thought, these birds are grooving. And I'm having all kinds of fantasies about myself that, here I've learned how to listen, or that nature was revealing herself to me. I was having this sort of ecstatic communion with nature, and the mosquitoes were swarming around the microphone and the rain isn't bothering me. And I think, this is it. And I keep the recorder going for about 10 minutes. And afterwards, I reach into my pocket to take out my phone because I wanted to take a picture. And that's when I saw it. It was the alarm on my iPhone. It had been going since 8 a.m. It was the alarm with the bird sounds. That symphony was my phone. There's got to be a moral in that somewhere. So here is my epilogue. I'm back in New York. I've made the journey from the northern boreal forest to the heart of capitalism. And if you go to the window in the other room and you look through, you can see a little sliver of Wall Street from the rear window. But there's one last person I met that I'd like you to meet. I went to Michigan that summer because I was looking for people whose lives were connected to Alberta oil through this vast network of pipelines that carry Alberta oil and its products into the global market. And Enbridge Line 5 carries Alberta oil right through the tip of Lake Superior. And that's how I met Frank Edwageshik. So Frank is the executive director of the United Tribes of Michigan and the governing board chair of the United League of Indigenous Nations. And he told me, when our ancestors reserved our fishing rights through the treaties, they didn't say that those are our fish. They reserved the right to fish, which meant they reserved the right to pray for the fish, to dance for the fish, to sing for the fish, to catch and eat the fish, to live with the fish, to have a relationship with the fish. That's what they were reserving. So they didn't think of it as property, but as having a relationship to the natural world. And that relationship is our real treaty right. And that relationship is what we need to protect. So for me, for years, when people asked me where I was from and I didn't have an easy answer, it wasn't just because Fort McMurray wasn't on the map. It was because I was kind of ashamed. I wanted to sound cosmopolitan, so I would say I was from Edmonton or Calgary, until later in my 20s when I realized there was a kind of a social capital and an extreme childhood. Then I maybe play it up a bit. I might tell you that Fort McMurray was a suicide capital of Canada at one point, or that they only built the road to get there just before I was born. But it doesn't matter really, because if you look at the page on my passport, you see place of birth, Fort McMurray, and date of birth, 1970. And if you know those two facts, then you can know a good chunk of the story of my life. And for years, I told myself that to pursue a life as a musician was to choose to sacrifice a part of my past, and I didn't look back. But all this time, I've carried with me this invisible atlas of Alberta. The texture of trees, the tone of the sky, the angle of light in the dusk driving north, the feeling of space, the rough, rapid fire of my uncle's voices, my granny's hands rolling dough for pierogies. And that bird I was recording, that's in there now too. It's a white-throated sparrow. I looked it up. They're born in the boreal forest of northern Canada. And like me, and this kind of blew me away, they migrate to the east coast of the United States. And they go back every year. And the Red River Jig is in the story now too. Because, you know, a good fiddler is not the best fiddler. A good fiddler is the one who moves your feet. He's the one who remembers enough of the tune to play it and who cares enough to keep playing. And the nice thing about a tune is that once you know it, you can play it any time you want. You don't even have to remember the tune. You just have to remember that it's still there. Thank you. That's it.
Wow. Wow.
That was amazing.
That was incredible, Tanya. That was a beautiful.